So this is the second time that CES has organised an event like this. So we've decided to host these discussions because we really wanted to have a focus on learning, and particularly for people that are working in public services, and also for people who have an interest in public services. The theme of this event is rapid implementation in different settings. And we want to use this time to really share learning across sectors, across disciplines, and also across jurisdictions. So the past 3 months has seen huge change happening in our services. So it's not only the scale of that change, but it's also the speed at which it is taking place that is really quite remarkable. So what are we learning as this change is happening, and what's different about it, and I suppose what can be sustained, or what can we take forward with us into the future? And I'm joined by 3 speakers, 3 people who are intimately experienced with the change that has been happening during this crisis. They are Yvonne O'Neill from the HSE, Tomás Ó Ruairc from the Teaching Council, and Marian O'Rourke from the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them shortly. But we just wanted to begin with, to run a couple of polls with you. So we're going to ask you just with 2 questions for you. So the first question, Katrina, you might give us our first poll. So it's quite a simple poll, yes or no. So have you or your organisation been involved in implementing something quickly in recent months? So we're talking about a service, a project, or a policy. And we'll just give people a few minutes. And if you'd like, you can also mention or give a little bit more information about what you're involved in within the chat. So it's great to see so many people from around the country joining us on such a wonderful day. So far, so we've got 75%, 76% voted, and a huge amount. So there's a huge wealth of experience in the room in terms of having experience with rapid implementation. And so hopefully you will have the chance to maybe share some of that again by using the chat throughout the hour. Okay, so we might move on to our second poll. Oh, that's okay. So, so if you have experience of implementing something, or if you haven't, you'll still have an opinion on our next question. So, can we get our second poll? Oh. So, based on your experience, and again, if you don't have direct experience of being involved in implementing something, you might have an opinion about what was the most important factor in making that happen. And you'll see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are a number of options there. So was the most important factor responding to needs of service users? Was it about skilled staff? Were there resources in place? Was it about leadership? Was it about relationships in terms of collaboration and partnership? Technology has been obviously a very important factor in the last couple of months. So was it to do with technology? Or if you'd like to mention other, you can feel free to include details of that in the chat. We'll just give people just a little bit longer to respond to that. Okay, somebody who can't see the poll. Okay, if you can't see it and you'd like to respond, so the answers were service user need, skilled staff, resources, leadership, relationships, technology, or in fact anything that you think that that was valuable or that was important in helping something be implemented quickly. Obviously, people are pointing out that the response was due to the COVID-19 crisis. So the urgency in terms of making that happen. So we've got we've got a tie, I think, a number of these things. So service user need, leadership. Service user need is the most important factor, leadership and relationships also. So I think these are really interesting themes, and a number of these themes I think would come up as we hear from our three contributors. Okay, so we can close that poll. Thanks. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we're going to run this session. So we've got three speakers who are going to share their thoughts and their experience with you. You can ask questions or make comments in the chat. And after all three speakers have given their input, we'll then have a panel discussion, look at some of the themes and some of the questions that are emerging within that. So the three speakers then, we're delighted to be joined by Tomás Ó Ruairc. So Tomás is director with the Teaching Council, which is the professional standards body for the teaching profession in Ireland, and it promotes and regulates professional standards in teaching. Yvonne O'Neill works with Ireland's Health Service Executive, so that's the HSC, and the HSC provides all of Ireland's public health services in hospitals and in communities across the country. So Yvonne is on the community side and works as head of performance, contracting and improvement in community operations. And our third speaker is from the north of Ireland, and that's Marian O'Rourke. And Marian is Interim Director of Regulation and Standards with the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. And the Social Care Council is the workforce regulator for social work and social care in Northern Ireland, and Marian is also a registered social worker. So thanks very much to the three of you for joining us today, and I'm going to invite Tomás to get us going, start the discussion going. Thanks, Tomás.
Thanks very much, Eve. I'm delighted to have everybody here for this webinar. I'm delighted to have the invitation from this effective service, my personal professional experience of implementation in the crisis. I'll call it maybe four quick examples, and we'll come back to them in the discussion, and then I want to talk about the context, sustaining yourself throughout this time, and some guiding principles as I see it, therefore, as we face into the emerging future. So in terms of examples of rapid implementation, I think most other organizations on this call, if not all, we had to close our offices during the lockdown, and we had no access for a number of weeks. And we had to basically reinvent an on-site to an off-site remote way of working all along while maintaining operations. And the metaphor I would choose to describe that is it's like rebuilding the train while the train is still moving and you're stuck on the platform. Because we're all working from home and we were trying to reconstruct, in our case certainly, we would have had many online services, but not all. And you're trying to reinvent and reorganize the whole way of working in real time when we had 24 hours notice for the closure of schools, for example. So that's been a real challenge. Also many decisions being made affecting student teachers as they're coming to the end of their programs, clinical practice being affected by the closure of the sites of practice, and also remote learning in school communities and how best to share good practice in that space. So where schools are continuing teaching and learning, but the schools are closed, and a bit like the Teaching Council, but at a much more micro-local level, how to reinvent how you teach and learn in that environment. I suppose in my own personal reflections, we are living in heightened times, is the way I would describe it. And there's a great word I came across recently, solastalgia, which describes the pain of where you're stuck in one place and everything else is falling apart around you. And that's the kind of pain, certainly, I think, as a society we've been experiencing for quite some time. And in these heightened times, at a personal, professional level, everything is amplified, including emotion. So all communications, all engagement with stakeholders, engagement internally with colleagues, externally with departments and other stakeholders, I think we need to keep reminding ourselves they are filtered through rotating prisons of stress and emotion. And we need to recognize that in ourselves as much as in others. Recognize this is a global pandemic that requires extraordinary interventions. At the same time, what I have learned is you are never alone as you think you are. Even we're all working like me from my bedroom here in Lucan in West Dublin, we are never as alone as we think we are. You've got colleagues in the organisation, the family, and loved ones, your own friends, and the importance of sustaining yourself, of organising things to do and talk about with others on an ongoing basis, to claim that time for yourselves as people, as individuals, whether it be Zoom book clubs, Zoom coffee or Zoom pints, but obviously not too much either, and the importance of physical exercise. In terms of how to plan and implement when everything is changing, in my own experience in the teaching council is trying to find two fixed poles between which everything else is fluid. So in our case, it's health and safety on the one hand. There's a fixed number of people that can be on the floor at any one point in time, and you cannot put people's lives and their health at risk. That's a fixed pole. And the other one being we could not countenance the cessation of operations. That much was fixed. Everything else was in chaos. Everything else was up in the air. But we had those two fixed poles in our mindset in the teaching council. It was a little bit easier to navigate the maelstrom in between. People react in different ways to the crisis. This much is very clear. So for some, it's blindly obvious that this is a serious global pandemic and extreme measures are required. And for others, yes, it is very serious, but we can't stay frozen forever. And we need to recognize and navigate those tensions, whatever policy space we might be working in. Again, that kind of emotional prism I referred to a few moments ago. One key lesson in terms of communications, I would say, clear, simple, early. Go big and go early. We didn't always do that in the teaching council. On one hand, we had a good example in school placement early on in the crisis. More recently, not so good an example in terms of communication because it took too long and became quite late in the day. So I've good experience of both the good and the bad in that space. I think as a kind of, if you're a leader at any level of the organization, I think we're all leaders now, the importance of recognizing, accepting, and constantly reminding ourselves we are not going to get this perfect. There is no vaccine for coronavirus. There is no silver bullet for all the challenges we face. So I think how we navigate that maelstrom in my experience, always be open to learning, to sharing your learning, to acknowledging we've got it wrong and be ready to adjust in rapid and real time. This is not a rehearsal as we keep and remind ourselves life does keep moving on. At the same time, trying to look a bit to the medium term and longer term future, thinking ahead as best we can, particularly in education, where the numbers are quite big. You have 70,000 teachers, a million students and pupils, 4,000 schools. Every problem you kick down the road, potentially, if that's what you're going to do, builds up a major capacity issue further down the system. So even when you're under pressure to make big, quick decisions, trying to think ahead of, well, if we move that 1,000 group on, it might not be possible to cater for them and everyone else is coming after them. So what I would call the pigs in the python conundrum rather than just the singular. At the same time, we all know sometimes it's essential to focus on the here and now. Sometimes you do have to deal with the urgent immediate. It can be that simple and serious. Other lessons from creativity, I think the importance, both in terms of your own personal well-being and the professional space, spaciousness, I've learned is important in creativity. It's important for us as people, and maintain your connections with people. Everyone is a leader now. Every single person, every part of the organization is a leader because we're all in our own spaces. And leaders look after themselves, they can look after others, with the airplane and the air mask analogy. Casting the eye a little bit to the future. Someone spoke to me recently of the tyranny of the immediate. The danger that we would look at this, we react to this crisis in such a way that we'd lock in ways of working and behavior that would not be needed in 2 or 3 years' time, the tyranny of the immediate. On the other hand, I speak of the opportunity of the ocular. And what I mean by that is seeing with new eyes. So looking at the opportunities that perhaps might be emerging, ways of working that may be a response to the immediate, but may in fact be good ways of working. And so, for example, we hear that children with additional learning needs in the education context, some of them are thriving because they have a much more relaxed pace of learning. They have much more control over their learning environments. On the other hand, the inequities in education are much more stark in terms of access to online learning platforms. And that's a challenge we'll face for the foreseeable future. And I think there's a need for a big conversation. If social distancing will remain part of our lives for the foreseeable future, with its impact on workplaces and on schools, we all need to pivot a little bit together and join the dots together. Employers, employees, their expectations of work, children, young people, adult learners, the teaching and learning assessment, all of that, we have a big conversation how we're actually going to make all that work for people in a sustainable way if this is the foreseeable future as seems to be emerging. More humane expectations perhaps around working hours, time with family, time supporting learning, time for ourselves. How will we connect better perhaps when we have more space and time to connect? Are we going to return to the way things were or not? So in the last minute I have left, a closing parting gift, a poem that I come to myself from time to time, just a kind of a personal moment of refreshment and reflection. It's called Presence by Norman McCaig, and it goes as follows. He says, I give you an emptiness, I give you a plenitude. Unwrap them carefully, one's as fragile as the other. And when you thank me, I'll pretend not to notice the doubt in your voice when you say they're just what you wanted. Put them on the table by your bed. When you wake in the morning, they'll have gone through the door of sleep into your head. Wherever you go, they'll go with you. And wherever you are, you'll wonder, smiling about the fullness you can't add to and the emptiness you can fill. And that, for me, resonates in different ways in terms of the crisis over the past 8 weeks, and it continues to unfold. So thank you for your time and attention. Thanks again for the opportunity. Look forward to our conversation.
Thanks very much, Tomas. I think thanks for that kind of very, that sharing that experience, I think, in a very, both a professional but also in a very personal way. So thanks very much for that. And I'm going to ask Yvonne now to share her experience within the health service. So Yvonne, you'll need to just unmute your mic, please.
You'd think I'd know by now, wouldn't you? Anyway, thanks for the intro. And I only just wanted to say a couple of things about the HSE, because I'm conscious from the audience that people may not know, particularly if you're not from the sector or the jurisdiction, but we provide health and social care service to 5 million people. It's a budget of about 17 billion, employing 110,000 people. So one of the reasons why I say that is because actually the fact that the HSE is the provider for health and social care actually has been, I think, a bit of an opportunity in the way in which we've been able to respond to COVID. And obviously that meant, like, unlike maybe other jurisdictions where social care is separate, so we did, I think, come from a better place. So if I can just revert to the fact that maybe that structures and systems bit actually matter in rapid implementation, but actually the opportunity to utilize the well-established working relationships, you know, so, and that's something that Tomas referenced there as well, the type of collaboration and relationship management. So that's within our services across hospitals and community, but also with the wider voluntary sector, who've been really important. I'll talk a bit about that later on, and our other sort of state providers like local authorities. So I won't go in I keep calling it sort of during peace times, but Nave has said that I am leading within the community health organisation. So most of the examples I'm going to talk about here are my experience during COVID largely around community services. And so I want to acknowledge particularly for HSE colleagues who might have joined, that if I give examples and leave out very significant work that you've been involved in, please accept my apologies now. I'm selecting from a couple of examples, and I do want to acknowledge the work that everybody has done in the last number of weeks in extenuating circumstances with all of the personal impacts that Tomas has described so well. So just the one other thing to say just about where I was coming from, and a lot of my colleagues on the community operations management team, is we have had a collaboration with CES, which I do want to acknowledge, which is why you're never allowed to say no to these requests to participate in webinars. But we've been very clear advocates for structured programmatic approaches and good governance and methodology and stakeholder engagement and all those things around implementation and trying to bring change and improvement in community services. And then along came COVID. So when I was asked to participate in this, I actually decided to try and think about it on the lens of actually what worked that we know is probably known in implementation science, and most people on the call are probably, you know, will have a familiarity about, you know, what makes for good change management. So what were the enablers? How were they sort of adapted? And then just give maybe some reference to that in terms of the types of themes. And one of the things that Niamh set for us, which was what might we hold on to when we're going forward, and we keep saying we can't say post-COVID because, as Tomas says, we could be here for a while yet. So one of the things I'd like to just, it's sort of like a bit of a chronology, but it is a storyline from me having to sort of jump out of my my main job to be able to participate in the COVID response. And the very first thing that for me was the first week in March was the establishment of governance. So although that sounds funny in a crisis, actually it ended up being a critical component to the HSE's response to COVID, which is clearly very large. And the Chief Operations Officer established an integrated operational hub, national hub for all things COVID related, which ended up being very significant just in terms of line of sight of problems and decisions. And that was replicated because we have a delegated operational delivery system across 9 large geographic areas in Ireland. That was replicated through area crisis management teams, which was an integrated governance for hospitals and community coming together around their solving the problems and agreeing responses for COVID. So if we can hold that thing, maybe governance is probably was maybe a surprise when I thought about it, because maybe we thought that's only something you do when you have a lot of time on your hands around approaching change and responding to problems. The other thing that from early March came very quickly was communications. Actually, and again, you think in a crisis, communications, but you go back and say, oh, we should have thought about that before. But in fact, it came up very quickly. And that was about guidance and information for people, but also much more probably newer ways of working. We would have had a HSE live helpline, but within a matter of 2 weeks, that was dealing with 168,000 calls, with a peak of 11,000 calls one day on the 12th of March. So that necessitated people to sort of flex. And I wanted to say something about that just in terms of collaboration. So that's, if I could have come up with something, if I'd had enough time, I'd probably found a range of C's, because I've talked about communication and collaboration. And that was a major feature as well in the establishment of a number of the responses that were required, because we were basically dealing with, say, a first notified outbreak in a long-term residential facility, so like a nursing home, which people will be familiar with from the coverage over the last number of weeks. But the first one was notified on 29th of February. So guidance was out with services on the 1st of March. And that and in addition to that, support teams were stood up as well then, which was about being providing supports to those services that were being more acutely affected. And the point there is less about the sort of the response, but more about the way in which it happened, because we haven't in the past maybe been good about collaborative responses and integrated responses, because that meant we had people from like acute geriatricians and palliative care, and then we had huge input in terms of infection prevention control from other types of specialties. So we had a coming together that maybe wasn't something that we would have done easily or quickly in the past. And I should say that, and Tom referenced, the types of he referenced young people who, would have disadvantage or vulnerabilities. And actually that was a key thing in both communication and collaboration for the HSE in its response to COVID, because we had a range of vulnerable groups, and even where language in relation to communications was a difficulty. And within a matter again of weeks, the communications, all of the standard communications that we would have been used to seeing, were all translated, I think, into something like 15 languages. And that was in very strong collaboration with voluntary providers in the system again, who although their own services and buildings may have not been available to them, they were fully able to respond and offer services that allowed us to do that. And one of the things, just to say, is one of the useful cross-departmental responses is actually, in terms of vulnerable adult children, is a joint piece of work between the Department of Education and the SNAs, who are going to, because they aren't deployed in schools, are going to be available for working with families with children with disabilities. And again, that would have been a very difficult thing. And although it wasn't one of our quickest responses in relative terms to normally how long it takes us to implement those types of changes, it is fairly dramatic. And I think though when I'm talking about all of these examples, I'm talking about things being stood up from the 1st of March to like before, within 2 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe the longest been sort of 6 weeks. So from concept to delivery. And I was thinking about that in the context of implementation and saying, well, okay, in normal circumstances, isn't time a massive factor? It just takes so long. So what are we learning about this sort of COVID environment? So I didn't want to say, well, is it all about just the sort of the absolute necessity? I also think it was about the common purpose and sort of common direction. And that, and a level of bringing together people who may have worn county jerseys in the past, who actually were brought together in ways to sort of deliver on solutions irrespective of rank or uniform. And that's something to just reflect on a little later in terms of sort of the type of leadership that came forward, which was nothing to do with your seniority in the organisation, but your core sort of leadership capacity, going back to Tomas's point about at the moment we're all leaders. The other thing that like I was looking at some statistics in terms of, there was obviously a requirement early on for the move out of hospitals to free up hospital capacity, and the sort of halving of what we used to call delayed discharges, but basically people in hospital waiting for places in the community. And I thought, well, how come within 2 weeks we were able to have those numbers, which could have been a year-long process otherwise? And I thought, well, there was certainly a loosening of the purse strings, but actually that's not what it really was. It actually, when we looked at it, was about a willingness to move away from some of the standard processes and forms and allow people, it was called discharge to assess, so people were allowed to leave before they had the full process behind them. And I wanted to hold on to that point about maybe how do we overuse in normal peace times, overuse rules and tools, and when is it appropriate for some of those to be loosened up, and could we hold on to some of that? One of the other things just around that I thought was interesting, and I was going to refer to the example about our response to the sourcing and distribution of PPE, which again would have been high in the radar for most people. And this, although I want to name a massive collaboration, so again that C comes up in terms of collaboration between the HSE, Enterprise Ireland, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the airline providers, couldn't have been done without that. But one of the things that actually struck me even more was that the way in which people came together, whereas we were designing systems for the supply and the delivery that were actually customer oriented. So sometimes our services are overly designed around the service for itself rather than its customer. So I do think that bit, coming back to the poll earlier on about the service user, is really essential. And the small teams bit, which is another thing, I think we can in peace times have large teams, lots of people in the room. This environment necessitated small teams, and with, you know, sort of less overhead in terms of coordination. And I thought that might be worth looking at as well, about what we might want to hold on to moving forward. I mean, everything is operationalized in the delivery system. So just to say on that PPE, just to give a shout out to colleagues, I just wanted to say that since mid-March, there's been 24,000 deliveries of 60 million items of PPE at a cost of 82 million. And none of that existed on the 1st of March. So like, we're talking about massive scale as well. So these are not, you know, responses in small scale to in the context of a crisis. And then just to say that in terms of everything been operationalized and therefore in the delivery system, and making sure that that is like more to the fore, and certainly I saw that in how our models have responded in the crisis, because we had a stakeholder engagement is something that we would have embedded in our way of working, our methodologies on improvement. But actually this was around an ownership of modeling, and so where actually the delivery people were actually a core part from the earliest point in relation to the what model might be delivered. And I saw that in relation to community testing, where again within a matter of 2 weeks we were testing, you know, but we've done about 180,000 appointments and 2,500 tests a day in 30 centres across the country that were all stood up within a matter of 2 weeks. So that sort of ownership is really important.
So I think you've mentioned a number of things there that I think would be really interesting to get into for the rest of the discussion. Anything from governance and structures to communications, time. But I'm just looking at, I'm going to invite Marian maybe now to share some, and then we'll come back, I think, to getting into some of the really interesting issues that you've raised there. Thank you very much. So over to you, Marian, and just to invite everybody to please do, if you've got a question or a thought or a comment, please do feel free to include it within the chat. Thanks, Marian.
Thanks very much, Niamh, and hopefully I will build on some of the themes that both Tomas and Yvonne have talked about today. And I suppose to start with, I think it's always worth paying attention to how our language changes with the times that are in it. Not that there's anything surprising in that, but it does tell us something about what's happening in people's lives. And we all notice new buzzwords, and there's lots of them around in the middle of COVID-19. So the word rapid certainly is being used a lot more, and another one is time. COVID-19 has created a sense of urgency and yet also a sense of slowing down, or the pace has changed. So we're talking about more time than before to focus on what is important. Rapid working and taking time, though, I think can fit together if we want to make sure that when something is happening at a faster pace, we also take the time to focus on what the real essence is that needs to be looked at. So for me, that's important. So I'm going to talk to you about how we in the Social Care Council have been using a rapid approach to some of our work since COVID-19 hit, but also taking the time to sharpen the focus of our lens. I think as a regulator, I have probably 3 important things to talk about that might be useful to you when you're thinking about your world in crisis. So 3 things. Firstly, get to know your part of the front line. Secondly, clear the way and increase the flow to the front line. And thirdly, stay relevant to the front line. So firstly, where is the front line for you? Who's on it and why? For us, social care workers and social workers, we're clearly going to be needed on the front line of a health pandemic that was going to affect people's lives, particularly older and more vulnerable people. We needed to very quickly understand what that might look like. Social care workers caring for older people in domiciliary care, in residential and nursing care, social workers providing support across the whole system, where people across the life cycle would struggle with stress, anxiety, and loss. So we quickly got to know what part of the front line was ours and what we needed to focus on. Secondly, I want to talk about clearing the way to the front line and making sure that there were enough of our people to be there as quickly as possible. As the regulator, our work is about making sure that those people are safe and able to do their job to a good quality standard. So we increased the flow of social workers through a call out to those who had left or retired to return. And that worked in small numbers, but the bigger push was in getting our student social workers qualified and out early from university. So by the start of May, we had 213 newly qualified social workers out and into that workforce. And for social care workers, we streamlined the registration process so that the flow would move faster. And since the 19th of March, we have added over 2,600 social care workers to that workforce. So thirdly, I want to talk about staying relevant to the front line, and what does that mean? This is how we work anyway, so we had a great advantage here. Supporting and developing our workforce is a key part of what we do. And working in partnership with employers, with practitioners, with service users and educators is how we do it. So we just had to look at what we already had in place, then quicken the pace, as well as taking time to sharpen our focus. What did our frontline need? They needed short, sharp guidance and training to cope with what was in front of them. They needed to be able to get that help remotely and at a time and place that suited them. And they also needed to know that they mattered, that someone was recognizing that they were there and appreciated what they were doing. So we knew what our strengths were, and we knew that we would have most impact by building on what was already in place. We have a free online learning zone with a whole range of resources that can be adapted to be viewed on any device, phone, tablet, laptop. We also knew that we have an online training and learning network for managers through the ecosystem that some of you may have experience of, that delivers short inputs, shares best practice, and is an opportunity to look at the common problems and talk about solutions. So we knew that would be important. We also have strong lines of communication through our social media presence and direct emailing to every one of our 48,000 registrants. And what we've found is that the direct emailing is actually our most successful way of communicating with people when we want to get information out. Very quickly, I want to tell you the story of how we developed one particularly relevant product. We knew that social care workers and social workers, and in fact a whole range of staff on the front line, were working with people who were dying and with families who are facing into the loss of a loved one and suffering from bereavement. So we made contact with a social worker whom we knew would be able to talk to us about what all of that was like and what was needed. A series of videos or something online. With one telephone conversation, she was able to say exactly what was needed. Yes, videos, something online that would help workers to have the difficult conversations, to know what to say, to help people talk about dying, to help them talk about what is important to them, saying I love you, saying I'm sorry, saying it'll be okay, helping them to talk about what were the things that for them needed to happen and help the families to cope with the loss, and that was better, you know, to happen then. She told me that some of the conversations were happening on the way to an ambulance, and that whilst that's not the ideal, it's more important for those families to have those conversations then than never. So I talked to that social worker on a Friday afternoon. I agreed for a Zoom call on the Monday morning with our workforce development team and with a production company that we work with. And on the Monday morning, we agreed that the product which we would develop would be a series of short videos from experts in the field who recorded on their own phones, in their own homes, and then we in the production company would build a digital resource around the videos. And then our communications team would launch it on our learning zone, email the link to everyone we knew, and promote it on social media, all within 1 week. We achieved all of this on Friday, the 3rd of April. The resource is called Hopes, Hints and How To, helping you to respond to living and dying issues during COVID-19. It's on our learning zone on our website, and to date it has been viewed in and around 10,000 times. So Niamh is going to send you the resource to you as part of the materials from today. And also I've asked her to share with you 3 other resources that we've been able to develop rapidly during this pandemic that have got a support for us to the front line, support that was needed to our front line. So one of them is on infection control, another on loneliness and isolation, and our most recent one is on self-care and resilience. And already within a week of that being released, it has been downloaded over 2,500 times. So I hope some of these are helpful to you and that you can use in your world, not just during this crisis, but as we move forward. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Marian, and thanks to the three of you for your contributions. A couple of comments just that are coming up in terms of the chat. So the people have mentioned the community hubs, and that, you know, this is a great example of collaboration. Another comment about the relationship between leadership capacity, purpose, authority, and timely responses, and that idea, I think, of you know, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good has come up. And a third point then from a couple of people. So a couple of people really went with this idea about how rules and tools can be, it can get in the way sometimes, and how it's important to, if you move beyond those, that, you know, you can lever innovative responses. And I suppose it might be interesting to think about, you know, how potentially more of that can be done, or what can we do to kind of free up, so the need for structure, but the need also to allow a place for innovation to happen. So so I wonder, would any of our, Tomás, you might like to come in on some of that, or some of the responses there?
Yeah, definitely. On the innovation piece, I was thinking of was our Learning for All webinar series that we launched with the Department's Professional Development Support Service for Teachers, because we were conscious that where the schools close overnight, there was kind of a variety of setups. Some schools very linked into broadband, and some schools maybe not so much. And then the whole issue of inequities at home. The best we could support, and I think I loved the emphasis on the relevance of the front line that Marian was talking about, and staying connected to your front line. And even though we are the regulator, we are a professional standards body to promote and regulate teaching. So this is the way to do it. Here, bring together and the good practice where schools are doing it, and they're facing the real challenge, and share them more broadly. And we've had DESH Band 1 schools, that's socioeconomic disadvantage, fantastic things with our school communities, sending that everyone would be aware of. And the other innovation on that series, I'll stop here, would be at every webinar, if at all possible, with teachers and parents and students speaking about their experience of remote online learning. And one of the most pleasantly surprising aspects was the power of the young person's voice in that. We have 6th class pupils, second-year students, talking about their experience of learning at home, from home, the positives and the negatives as well. And so that importance of, I think, as Marian was saying, connecting and staying relevant to your front line has been very much underpinning of that webinar series.
Yeah, so also, just Yvonne, just one of the things that you had mentioned or talked about in your contribution was just the whole role of telehealth. And indeed, when people talk about innovation and you know, moving beyond the tools and rules, I suppose one of the things that's helped us to do that is technology. I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about that, and I suppose how services are adapting to the more widespread use of technology.
Yeah, no, it's like it's been a huge sort of learning for us as well, because those type of telehealth responses have been things that we had started, but actually it was slow. We were slow, but take up during COVID, because we were able to sort of free up again. Some of the rules and tools were eliminated. So we made Attend Anywhere available, like WhatsApp. You couldn't download WhatsApp on a HSE phone pre-COVID. Microsoft Teams was only for a few people. Now everybody has it. And all that sort of happened within a couple of weeks. So the most important thing was the sort of reach that gave us. So we're, you know, we've been offering psychological support services and a range of other sort of patient interfaces using Attend Anywhere and Silver Cloud as a couple of options. And just to say that in a way, like both in terms of the telehealth solutions, but also in terms of some of the other models, that minimal prototyping, testing, where good was good enough, I think is a big lesson to hold on to as well. Because it turns out when you look back at some of the models, like people have referenced the hubs, or they haven't changed dramatically in terms of what their concept or design was within 2 weeks of being stood up. So often good is good enough. And that's certainly been a huge part of being able to deliver the online and telehealth technologies as well, for offering services that otherwise wouldn't have been available to people. And I just to come back on Marian's points as well, because and I think there's been a good collaboration even with our North of Ireland partners in developing a number of the psychosocial supports and bereavement services within a matter of weeks of some very difficult experiences, both for staff and other service users in experiencing very ill and sadly people passing away. So again, I think we're going to live with this for quite some time. So what was stood up as a crisis response around psychosocial supports is now a established program which will develop and continue to deliver and scale up for the next number of whatever, I think, years to come, particularly in the post-COVID environment when people get a chance to absorb the experience.
Thanks, Yvonne. And just a couple of comments here, and somebody mentioning that yes, we are on a journey with technology, and it's been accelerated due to the crisis. And I suppose it is something that we've all had to get to grips with pretty quickly, but particularly frontline workers, and that more needs to be done in order to enable the workforce. I'm just interested, Marian, in terms of the social care workforce in the North, just how the experience has been of accessing the kind of online resources and the formats that you've been talking about.
Yeah, interestingly, just before the pandemic started, we had undertaken a survey with the social care workforce to see whether or not they had an appetite for technology. Because we were very conscious that within the health and social care system, I suppose the social care workforce is one of the largest workforces, but yet it's probably one of the least recognised, least valued in terms of their terms and conditions. And so, do they have access to technology? Do they have a smartphone? Do they have computers at work? And the answer to that, we were expecting is no. We were expecting to see, an older workforce who maybe wouldn't be interested in technology. And we were very pleasantly surprised by our findings that said, this is a very diverse workforce, young and old, working there, great interest in technology, great interest in learning and getting access to learning. And people are prepared to use their own devices to access that learning. And so we pushed ahead, certainly, with using that as a platform for engaging with them. And that has helped us and stood to the fore in relation to that. But I suppose what we do need to recognise is that whilst we want to improve people's knowledge and skills in delivering the quality of care that's needed, it's really important that we just don't cast them off in terms of technology and expect them to do that all online without a relationship, without an engagement with us as employers, us as regulators, us as educators, with service users. We need that relationship-based connection, and we need that blended approach, I think, to learning, where technology has a big part to play but is not the only approach.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Mary. I think that's a very, very valuable point there, and one that a lot of people will identify with. And just to say also, there's a message here about the public health nursing service in Wicklow, which has been using Attend Anywhere for the past 6 weeks, and the quick implementation of the technology has facilitated well-needed digital innovation, not just in response to COVID restrictions, but has also enabled ideas for remote nursing we had before March. So that sounds like that has been a really positive experience. But Tomás, you might also share, I mean, one of the, of course, the frontline services that has been really affected by this and has really had to embrace technology is the teaching profession. So, you know, what has the experience been like there?
It's been really interesting. I mean, people might remember there was some controversy about the use of iPads in schools just before the COVID pandemic. A school in Ratoath where there had been a petition where schools are compelled to use of iPads, particularly here, and many of the parents objected. And there was research cited that questioned, I think, some of the impact of the use of technology in that way. That seems a distant memory now. If necessity is the mother of invention, that's what we've had to be doing in many respects. So that, it's been quite interesting to observe that, but also teachers, I think, have been responding, as I said, depending on the capacity in the school. Some schools have great capacity for live ones, no problem. Then there's the synchronous teacher. My own daughters are using that. They're in a local Gael school, and will be apps, Seesaw and so forth. You can do audio and some visual stuff, so you can record yourself reading to the screen, reading out your piece for the teacher, and the teacher will give back on that. But I think it's correct what Marian and Yvonne about talking about I think, and then Liz chat. Sorry, relationship-based connections are absolutely. Sorry, am I back?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Relationship-based connections are absolutely vital. They really miss the physical presence of each other in the classroom.
Yeah.
So those are okay. I think one of the questions also asked about the blended online learning, how that will work in the future. I think we're still working the answer out to that. But the final piece is then those children and young people in environments where they don't maybe have the bandwidth or any bandwidth at all, or where there might be 10 people in the house and one laptop. And how do they engage in a remote online learning environment? And schools are doing the hard copy letters home, etc. They're dropping parcels under the various DESH schemes. That continues. But there's, I think, definitely a piece to be considered. And I think Yvonne used the phrase a lot in her comment of peacetime. Okay. Sorry, am I back again? Yeah. So one of my daughter's friends is trying to FaceTime her right now.
Okay, Tomás. Well, in this instance, I think that the daughter is clearly winning the battle of the broadband there.
And Eve.
Yes, go.
No, I was going to say that. Yeah.
But the last piece in terms.
We've lost you again, Tomás. We've lost you again. Yvonne, the floor is yours.
I was only going to come back to say that actually one of the things that I think there's a beginning an increasing evidence or people are writing about is that they're talking about the sort of loss of context as well when you're constantly on Zooms, constantly on Microsoft Teams, that you actually sort of move from a pace and you lose context for that sort of human interaction bit and that Tomás is talking about. And I think that people are finding that now a number of weeks on in terms of resilience. And although so certainly lockdown is lonely, but video calls are transactional and they're relentless. But it's interesting that actually people are describing what they're missing is just some alone time to do problem solving in their heads, which the nature of some of the way in which we're working now is literally just so relentless from call to call that some time that we might have taken out in our office just to take some time to think and problem solve. So it's just literally alone time as opposed to being lonely, which I think was a very interesting insight.
Yeah, that's really good. Tomás, we cut you off there. Did you want to finish your point there?
Well, two things. One, I couldn't agree more with Yvonne. One of my colleagues spoke about how the informal 5-minute coffee in the canteen is gone. And so every interaction as colleagues in the organization is a formal meeting on Teams or Zoom or something like that. And the opportunities we have to resolve matters in a quick coffee chat are gone. And you're trying to, and that drains in its own way in terms of being able to read body language and so on. So it's a really important point. But the final point I was making was, I loved Yvonne's references to the peacetime, and by implication, this is almost a warlike effort we're engaging in. Certainly, I would say across both education and health, and resources are being marshaled in a way that we never thought possible. Like Yvonne said, the 60 million euros worth of equipment ordered in 6 weeks. I think that warlike effort is required for education for the most disadvantaged in the hybrid learning environment. We have the technology, we have the hardware, we cannot excuse a lack of connection to online and hybrid learning simply because you haven't got the broadband, or simply because there are challenging circumstances in the home. We must find workarounds to make sure that all children can engage in teaching and learn on an ongoing basis in the COVID-19 crisis. It is that serious and important because their life chances depend on it.
And I just want to, yeah, there's an interesting comment here actually that somebody has just raised. Important to note that communications types of technology have flourished pending broadband quality in COVID-19, but wonder about data gathering, analysis and management tools to support the evaluation of work processes and systems to focus and refocus resources, which I think is that is certainly another challenge. The point I think that you've been making about the blended approach that Marian had mentioned and the need for relationships, I think lots of people in agreement with that and saying that that's a really important thing going forward. You know, that, or that if, for example, somebody has mentioned you can't debrief, you know, you don't have that physical process, and that people miss those kind of informal chats or debriefing where you meet interesting people, share projects, ideas and learning. So the whole area of networking, which is, you know, it is a very important part of implementation, is quite challenging. So we're coming up to the hour. So I'd like to just invite the panel to sort of mention any kind of final thoughts about, I suppose, you know, what can be sustained or what can be adapted within the future, to make any kind of closing remarks to this to the discussion very quickly, just a couple of seconds each. Marian.
Okay, so I suppose my closing thought is that we need to take time and reflect and learn from what this experience is teaching us, not just in terms of technology, but new ways of working. And one of the people that we need to learn most from is the people who are receiving the services that we all deliver. So we need to listen most to them.
Great. Yvonne?
So just two final things I'd say. One is about the point around leadership, and actually I think what a crisis offered was people with incredible capability stepping forward. And how do we get our organizations to do that in peacetime, where we give people problems to solve, and that we take away some of the seniority hierarchy, particularly in big organizations like ours. And the only other thing I just wanted to say was there is an element of that we need to look at, which is about tolerance of risk. You know, so again, during that sort of crisis period, we had a higher tolerance of risk. I would worry that as things come out of a crisis, we'll revert to sort of backward looking, like how off plan, off budget are we? And actually, I wondered about how we could make sure we keep a level of forward focus to where we are now, and how do we step forward? So there were sort of two things that stayed in my head as well from our conversations.
Really great, Yvonne. Thanks. And Tomas, any final comments or thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, I would say the crisis is stripping everything back. And when we find ourselves having to make difficult decisions in an urgent pressurized situation, for me, the question that surfaces, what is the fair, decent and humane thing to do here? So the rules and tools conundrum that Yvonne talked about earlier on, and we're breaking the shackles of that in so many different ways. But so often it comes back to that. What is the fair, decent and humane thing to do here? Secondly, I would say claim the time for that informal contact. No one's going to give it to us. The first 4 weeks I spent working right up to the last minute, more hours at home than I was doing in the office, and it wasn't sustainable. So if we're looking for that informal contact and we're missing it, we've got to make it happen. We've got to claim the time back for that. And finally, I would say that the importance of triangulating everything we're doing in a community context. We've no excuse anymore not to connect the voices together, because technology means when you have the connection nearby in a hub or in your home, you can be part of the conversation. So in the policy space in particular, we need to road test as we move out of the urgent phase of the crisis into a more medium-term position. How will this land, I should say, in the community context? And that would be my closing comments. And thanks again.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Tomás, for that. So as we draw this session to a close, if you'd like to share with us your takeaway, so something that you learned or that was useful for you during this session that you'll take forward into your work, please do that in the chat. Also, just a reminder that if you'd like to keep in touch and find out about future, we will be organising more of these events over the coming months. So keep an eye on our website, effectiveservices.org. You can sign up to our mailing list and keep in touch with what's going on. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and for spending the hour with us here on this really lovely sunny evening, and wish you the very best. Enjoy the bank holiday and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Niamh.
Thank you.